All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I will pass it over to Ingrid Nuttall.
Thank you so much, Cass, and good afternoon, everyone. I really appreciate you joining us today. I am going to do just a brief introduction of our presenter, Emily Baxter, who is the Executive Director of We Are All Criminals. I met Emily a couple of years ago when we both attended an orientation for an organization that supports people who are currently incarcerated and also supports them after they get out through reentry programs. And when I met Emily, we chatted about her project, and I looked into it on my own and was really struck by the way that she talked about individual personal stories to also talk about broader issues related to mass incarceration. So I have been personally affected by incarceration in my life. I have family members who are very close to me who have been incarcerated. And dealing with that history has been something that has been challenging for me until very, very recently. And it was through my participation with We Are All Criminals and getting to know Emily that I started to think differently about that history and how it has meaning in my life. And the reason I wanted Emily to do this presentation for you today is because, you know, in our work in registrars and admissions offices, we are at an important intersection with a lot of different lives. And we deal with a lot of policies and a lot of processes, and I know that everyone, all of my fellow ACRA members are really committed to excellence and also to supporting students. And I felt that this particular topic, the way that Emily is going to approach it is going to be a really broad topic about some important issues that hopefully you're going to walk away with and be able to think about these ideas within the context of not just your day-to-day work, but also kind of your lives in general. So one of the goals of We Are All Criminals is to advance mass social change, but really that starts with personal change. So I hope that you take something away from this presentation personally today, and I really look forward to your questions. They're always very, very important questions that come up when Emily does this presentation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Emily, and I'll be happy to take your questions throughout the when we get to points in the presentation where we're stopping to moderate for those questions, but please put them into the chat whenever you have them if you don't want to forget them, and I'll make sure I take note of them. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Emily.
Hello. Thank you, Ingrid, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to join you today. This is truly an honor not to just present with a friend, but with my boss, dear Ingrid. I'm really excited about this. So let's get started, shall we? Have you ever been convicted of an offense? Yes or no? That's the question that had been weighing upon Anthony's mind as he hovered in the back of a government center basement room 6 years ago. Yes, he would have to check on his job applications, the last 13 to be exact. Yes, on his rental application. Yes, on his loan application. Yes, on his college application. Yes, yes, yes. What would you check? Have you ever been convicted of an offense? Perhaps like me, you could say no. If, however, you said yes, like Anthony, you're one of the estimated 65 to 100 million people in the U.S. with a criminal record. Let me tell you how I met Anthony. Several years ago, I left my job in public defense to work in public policy. I thought that if I could change the laws that were so acutely affecting my clients, I could be a better advocate. I took a job at a legal nonprofit in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and my focus was on criminal records. We held these expungement clinics in the basement of that government center in a small windowless room. In this space, men, women, and youth, all poor, predominantly people of color, would wait for hours to speak with an attorney, someone who might, in theory, be able to help them with a second chance that could wipe that slate clean. I'm sure the sun had long since set when one night in walked our last participant. Anthony was tall, he was thin, he was black, and he was clearly distraught. He walked hesitantly toward me, and as he sat across the table from me, he pulled from his back pocket a copy of his criminal record, a printout he had received from a computer terminal 2 flights up. Given this man's clear distress, I was nervous to open it. What might it contain that it could cause him so much stress? I was thankful and a little surprised to see that it contained no more than a theft, and a minor one at that. I let out a short laugh of relief. Even if the court doesn't expunge the matter, I said, it's not like your life is over. And with that, Anthony began to cry. He told me that earlier that day he had, in fact, considered taking his own life. You see, while it was just a theft to me, to Anthony, it was a lost job. It was missed housing payments. It was skipped meals. It was door after door slammed in his face. It was the loss of respect from his friends and family, the loss of a sense of self, the loss of hope. Around the same time, I'd been driving all around the state, reaching out to employers and landlords, legislators, and licensing boards, asking them to create the capacity for second chances within their own realms of control. Time and again, I would hear, you can't trust a con. Once a criminal, always a criminal. Those words came back to me as I looked at Anthony. I thought, how many times had I taken something that wasn't mine? Sure, I considered my own criminality before, but not like this. I hadn't really thought about what life would be like in the shadow of that record, under the suffocating stigma of having been caught. What would life be like if I didn't have the luxury to forget? 1 in 4 people in the United States has a criminal record. 1 in 4. I contend that 4 in 4 have a criminal history. For the past few years, I've been asking people like me, the 75% of people in the U.S. with criminal histories but no record, what have you had the luxury to forget? Today, I want to share with you some of those stories. Now, I'll focus mostly on crimes committed before participants' brains were fully developed. Now, some are going to be petty, some are serious. Some happened decades ago, others a bit more recently. In doing so, I hope to offer a new and personal way of examining the true effects of our juvenile and criminal justice systems and the disparate impact of those systems upon poor people, people of color, and indigenous people across the U.S. But first, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. This is a graph of data taken from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and it shows the U.S. state and federal prison population between 1925 and 2013. Now, barring for some general population growth, you can see that the number of people we put behind bars in America is pretty much steady until about the 1970s. Then, more than 4 decades ago, we began the deliberate and regrettable march toward this, the caging of more than 1.5 million people. Wars on drugs, mental illness, and poverty, private prisons, 3 strikes rules, mandatory minimum sentences, and concentrated policing in minority communities are just a few of the many policies and practices that have led to this disaster. Now, this mass incarceration is not only unprecedented in our own history, it's unparalleled in the world. And we claim approximately 5% of the world's general population, but nearly 25% of the world's incarcerated population. We have become the world's wardens. What's additionally concerning is what happens to people once they're no longer in the system, when they're back in the community trying to get on with life. That's when a new punishment begins. When people find that they may no longer be locked up, but are now locked out. Locked out of jobs, housing, school, and countless opportunities to move on and move up. Now, before we delve into the world of collateral consequences or those lifelong effects of a criminal record, let's turn back to this graph. As I said, it shows the U.S. state and federal prison population. But just as importantly is what it doesn't show. It doesn't show the millions of people in county and parish jail, for example, those on civil commitment or on immigration hold. It doesn't show kids in juvenile detention. It doesn't show the millions of people on probation and parole, their liberties curtailed, just not behind bars. It also doesn't show the estimated 65 to 100 million people like Anthony with a criminal record, suffocating under the stigma of that record, unable to come up for air. And just as importantly, it doesn't show the nearly 3
million sons and daughters, countless brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, spouses and partners and greater family and community members who can all be profoundly impacted when someone is taken out of the home and then not allowed back in. They are not shown here on this graph. So what may initially appear to be a tsunami of humanity ready to crash upon our shores, you realize it's just a drop in the overall greater ocean of a crisis. And that crisis comes at no small cost. Every year, the U.S. spends nearly $80 billion locking people up and keeping them under control. But even that doesn't include what communities spend to house and train, educate, counsel, treat, employ, and otherwise transition people leaving prison or jail. And that is a burden that is not borne equally across our country. For example, from the Sentencing Project, the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment for black males born in 2001 is 1 in 3. For white women, it's 1 in 111. Now, this is not to say that white women aren't committing crimes, right? But we're not who you see, proportionately speaking, in our prisons. Importantly, note that the rates of offending do not come close to explaining these disparities. Looking at just the war on drugs, for example, perhaps one of the greatest contributing factors to our current carceral crisis. White and black individuals use and sell drugs at roughly the same rate. Yet black individuals are far more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, prosecuted, and punished for engaging in drug-related activity than are whites. In addition to people of color, our system disparately affects poor people, people with mental health and chemical dependency concerns. And yet we do little to address these issues once someone's in the system. In fact, we do a lot to exacerbate these very problems. Prison is warehousing with trauma. With too few exceptions, meaningful educational and treatment opportunities, they're non-existent. People leave lockup saddled with criminal records, making second chances, or indeed even first, exceedingly rare. To put it bluntly, people enter the system disadvantaged and are spat out even more so. Now, understand that these disparities start early. For example, black youth as young as 5 are suspended and their actions criminalized at far higher rates than their white classmates for engaging in the same behavior. And note that kids these days are growing up in the data age where a scarlet letter can be stamped upon the ether that no amount of scrubbing can clean. Futures are being foreclosed before brains are even fully developed. Now, out of the juvenile world and back into the adult realm, according to the National Employment Law Project, 1 in 4 people in the U.S. has a criminal record. According to the Bureau of Justice statistics, that number may be closer to 1 in 3, and those waters just keep rising. Criminal records are no minor matter. By the way, they can influence nearly every aspect of life, from employment to housing to professional licensure, access to public benefits, education. We can pause on this one for a hot sec. You know, understanding that the common application, the form that's used by more than 600 colleges and universities nationwide to determine the makeup of next year's new admissions, it asks the question, have you ever been convicted or adjudicated delinquent of an offense? Yes or no? And can you imagine your ability to access education limited to a checked box? And while some may say that that is just one question in a much longer algorithm in determining who would make a good fit, make no mistake the chilling effect that that question can have on applicants with records. Because unlike employment, here you have to pay to be denied. $20, $30, $50, $60 a shot just to be told that because of your history, you are not a good fit. This at a time when there's no compelling research that shows us that prior juvenile activity has any bearing on future campus safety, and at a time when so much research is showing that access to education is one of the greatest determining factors in a reduced recidivism rate. We should be pushing people into school at a time when we are locking them out. The ability to immigrate can be affected by the presence of a criminal record. So too can the ability to travel and the right to cast a ballot. And these are just a few of the myriad consequences that attach to a record. This is death by 1,000 cuts, where a pound of flesh is no longer enough. It's as if we believe that the only appropriate consequences are those that eviscerate a person, his or her family, and his or her future too. Criminal histories affect nearly every aspect of who we are and how we engage with the world. From social to psychological, from personal to professional, we are confined and defined by our criminal past. But not for everyone. Really, only for a few of us. Just 1 in 4 of us. The rest of us have had the opportunity to skate through life unscathed by that record. In 2012, I sent out a flyer through our social service network at the nonprofit where I was working, stating quite simply, "We are all criminals," and asking, "What have you had the luxury to forget?" I included my contact information, and I honestly didn't expect to get much of a response. Now, I asked our network not to respond, by the way. I didn't want to hear from people that I already knew, so I asked them to forward it on, send it to their coffee clubs, their faith groups, their college campuses, so that people contacting me would be 2, 3, 5 times removed from me. To my unending surprise, the phone actually started to ring. I bought a camera and a recorder. I hopped in my hatchback and I drove all across the state and now all across the United States, meeting people in bars and in cars, in diners, and quintessentially Minnesotan on boats. Anywhere where someone might feel comfortable enough to tell me something they've otherwise never had to tell. They've never had to explain. You can find the first 80 of the more than 300 stories I've collected so far on the website at weareallcriminals.org. Check it out. And when you do, you'll note that if you click once on any of the participants' pics, you'll see how they are introduced into the world, right? Like as a doctor or a lawyer, as an educator or policymaker. But after that professional title, you'll see how they would be defined in the world had they been caught. Theft, sale of controlled substances, assault, driving while intoxicated. Click twice and you'll go into the story itself. Now, as I said, these range in severity from quite serious, like this student and his aggravated robbery. "I just wish I'd made a different decision," he said, to this pastor who brought a loaded gun on an international flight. "They never treated me as a criminal," she said. "They were concerned that I was in danger." To the relatively innocuous, like this gentleman who carried a beer from one house party to the next. That's an open bottle. He also failed to return a library book. That's that petty theft, which is an offense, by the way. Check your shelves. Make sure you don't have any collecting dust that you need to return. The next one down that he was about to write right there was public urination. This gentleman now has a contract to work with the Department of Defense, some of the highest security clearance in the nation. Had he been caught, he would find difficulty getting a job at a gas station. I know because many of my clients were denied those very jobs for possessing these very records. This woman as well had a relatively minor list of offenses. When she was a young teen, her mother died, and she shoplifted the pain away. She said she would steal bangles and LPs, which she demonstrated how she would leave the store with a record kind of stuffed under her shirt. I think that would take a certain amount of talent, or at least some very baggy clothing. She, by the way, is now recognized as a leader in her community. Likewise, the responses to the recollections of past transgressions have also been varied. Take this gentleman, for example. He told me about a time he had taken his uncle's hunting rifle out to college with him. One drunken night, he decided to liberate the money within a double-posted parking meter. A single shot went right through the locking mechanism. That's it, right there, letting loose $40 worth of quarters. He calls it his $40 shot, and he laughed throughout the entire interview. Or this woman who told me about a time as a teen when she would break into her neighbor's homes, eat their ice cream, rifle through their junk drawers, and occasionally swipe some silver. She laughed, pleading with me, "Just please don't tell my son." She is now a CFO. Some people note not just the luxury to forget, but the luxury to not regret, while others are deeply sorry. This woman could have been charged with a whole slew of offenses, including, I believe, trespassing, criminal damage to property, harassment, bullying, and so on. She is now a probation officer. This woman told me about a time when she was working as a barista. She said that she used to pad her tips with bills from the till. Maybe a quarter here, a few quarters there, every now and then $1, $5, a $10 bill. As she told me this, the tears streamed down her face. She said, "I cannot imagine what life would be like now had I been labeled a thief then." And then there are several that just cannot begin to wrap their heads around what life would be like had they been caught, like the woman for whom I took this photograph. She said that when she was 16 years old, she was a bit of a nerd, a chemistry buff, if you will. One bored July day, she and some of her nerd friends decided that they would make their own homemade napalm, which apparently you can do with just a few common household ingredients. Don't worry, Ingrid, I will not share that recipe right now. They whipped up this highly flammable viscous gel in an apple cider glass jar. They let it sit overnight and then took it out to a state park where they found the small, enclosed, ideal space upon which they could test their substance. They doused the inside of this porta potty with the gel, lit a tennis ball on fire, lobbed it in, and watched it blow. They then ran back to their cars and drove the speed limit the entire way home, terrified over what had just happened. The day that I interviewed her, that morning, she had been keeping a 3-month-old heart alive with her index finger, beating it for the baby. She's a pediatrician. In many states, an arson, or the destruction of a structure with a homemade explosive, is a permanent disqualifier from working with vulnerable people, most definitely kids. It wouldn't have mattered that she was just a kid when it happened. It wouldn't have mattered that no one got hurt. It wouldn't have mattered that she was terribly sorry for what she had done. All that would have mattered was that the act occurred and she was caught, and she would be permanently barred from working with vulnerable individuals. It gives you pause, doesn't it? Or at least I think it should. When you consider all of the waste in the state, when again, were foreclosing futures before brains are even fully developed. Time and again, I heard from people who recognize that crime is an event in a life course, not a static characteristic of one's being. Like this teacher who said, experimenting with delinquency is normal, and so is giving it up. I have that story, he said. Everybody has that story. If you find someone who claims that they've never committed a crime, either they're lying, they have a very poor memory, or they're very abnormal. I've heard from law enforcement officers who reflect upon the weight of the mistakes that they've made, and from salespeople who could be known by their mugshots rather than by their merit if their battle with addiction had been criminalized. Although not everybody has recalled their past quite so quickly. Like the gentleman for whom I took this photograph. Remember I said I sent out flyers through a social service network and asked that those flyers be forwarded on? By the time it came into this man's possession, it had been passed through several channels. So this gentleman had no context for the larger conversation, much less this particular one. So when he got this flyer that said, "We are all criminals, what if you had the luxury to forget?" he was ticked off. He said he couldn't believe that some punk in the cities was calling him a criminal just because he was a member of the human race. He said that for 3 weeks he would pick up his phone and dial all but my last digit, ready to call me up and read me out. Then, around the 3rd week, something clicked. He remembered that he used to run drugs across Lake Superior. How do you forget something like that? You forget something like that when you think of drug trafficking as something that happens between strangers in darkened alleyways, not something that happens between college friends. So here's what happened. His freshman year, he left his hometown, traveled across the lake, and went to school in some small private college. Sophomore year, he transferred back to his hometown, where he moved in with some of his old high school friends. It turns out his buddies were no longer just smoking dope, now they were selling it. And this gentleman became the ideal conduit to the untapped market across those stormy waters, right? He knew who the potential narcs were. He knew who the legitimate smokers were. So he said, they trained me in on phones. I would occasionally take the drugs, gather the money. He said, but really, do you think that I did anything that would qualify as criminal? And I had to explain to him, yes, absolutely criminal, absolutely state, federal, felonious, yes. And on his own, he then began to pick apart his life. He said, what would have happened if I had been caught? My God, I wouldn't have finished school. If I wouldn't have finished college, I wouldn't have gotten that first internship where I met my wife. If I wouldn't have met my wife, I wouldn't now have my 2 sons. He said, okay, hold on. Let's say that by some cosmic confluence, I still did meet my wife. I still did have my 2 sons. What kind of father would I be, he said. For example, every year he volunteers on his son's hockey league team and to coach for them. And every year they ask the question, have you ever been convicted of any of the following offenses? And it lists 10 offenses. And each year he blithely checks no. He said if they were to ask, have you ever committed any of the following crimes, he doesn't know how he would respond. And my goodness, had he been caught, he said, I don't know what I would do. He said, okay, I would have 3 options. The first option, I could lie. I could say, no, never been convicted. This is the gentleman that nearly got an ulcer from a flyer. He was not about to lie. If somebody were to Google his name and find his criminal history, he just couldn't handle it. So no, option number 1 was taken off the table. Option number 2, he said, I could check, yes, we'll explain. He said, but that won't work either. You see, for the past 10 years, this gentleman has owned his own business, and for the past 10 years, he has asked the question, have you ever been convicted of an offense? And if somebody said, yes, we'll explain, it didn't matter. He didn't want to know. He would trash the application because he didn't want to work with a criminal. He said, even more than that, even if I did explain, he understood that the stigma wouldn't just stick with him, but that stigma would run down to his sons, and he wouldn't do anything that would harm his boys. So that was off the table as well. He said the only option that I would have left was the option number 3. I could just not respond. I can't tell you how many people I have worked with who have just stopped responding, because you can only take that door slammed in your face so many times before you begin to give up. Now, make no mistake, I'm not saying that individuals with criminal records can't be outstanding fathers. Absolutely they can. Fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, leaders. What I am saying is that for the 25% of us who do not have criminal records, we are constructing barriers that lock out, the 75% of us who do not have criminal records, we are constructing barriers that lock out the 25% that do. And sometimes we don't even realize that we're doing it. Time and again, I have heard so many stories of people engaging in drug-related activity on college campuses. The Lake Superior gentleman was by no means the first and certainly not the last. Like this gentleman, for example, who donated part of his FAFSA funds to help finance a drug ring. He said he wanted a girlfriend. He got one. Or this woman who said that she sold weed to frat bros and football players so that she could get a hey, what's up in the hallway. She said she was sick of feeling invisible. And I've heard some truly heartbreaking stories, like the gentleman for whom I took this photograph. At 15, he struggled to survive. He soon found that joining a gang offered him with a chance of getting to school and back without getting beaten up. But that didn't come for free. One Saturday morning, he was told that if he didn't pick up the lead pipe and hit the child, the kid that looked a lot like him, a member of a rival gang, he'd be the one beaten. He said he made the decision that day that he's regretted every day since. In fact, not a month goes by where he doesn't wake up at least once in the middle of the night screaming, thinking that it's all happening again. He picked up that pipe and he hit that child. The boy was dragged away. Had he been caught, he would have been charged with first-degree assault for the benefit of gang. He would have been certified to stand trial as an adult. He likely would have been convicted. Once convicted, he would have entered that system and likely the vicious cycle of in prison, out of prison, in prison, out of prison, in prison, out of prison. He wasn't charged. He graduated from high school, got a scholarship to go to college. There he said he was able to read an entire paragraph. He could complete a math problem. For the first time, he wasn't constantly checking over his shoulder to see what was coming next. He was able to concentrate. He was safe. His grades skyrocketed. He went on to graduate school and now has a PhD in biophysics. We Are All Criminals is about the human cost of mass criminalization. We have all violated the law, each and every one of us. But far more importantly, we're all human, and some of us, perhaps 1 in 4 of us, may be in need of a second chance. But make no mistake, this project is also a commentary on the disparate impact of our nation's policies, policing, and prosecution. Many, not all, but many of the participants have benefited from belonging to a race and class that is not overrepresented in our criminal justice system. And I apologize, it appears that I got kicked out of the thing, but I think I'm back in.
Okay.
Okay.
Emily, I moved the slide along.
Okay, thank you. I do have some pretty spotty coverage here, but I'm impressed that we were able to get this far before the Wi-Fi booted me out. I think I'm back on. All right. So many, but not all of the participants that have shared their stories, shared their humor and humility with We Are All Criminals have belonged to a race and class that is not overrepresented in the criminal justice system, but most have. And some of them have been pretty straight up about that, like this gentleman who said that he was a drug user, but it's cool, I'm white. There we go. As a teenager, this gentleman fashioned himself to be the next Steven Spielberg. One day, he and his friends decided to direct and star in a mock-up of Dirty Harry. They dressed up as bank robbers, complete with replica firearms, briefcases stuffed with stacks of fake cash, and nylons pulled down over their heads. The camera was set up on the back of their car, the venue was an alley, and the backdrop was a bank. An open for business, middle of the day, bustling with bodies bank. Within minutes, they were surrounded by squads. Drop your weapons! One of the guys refused to put his fake gun down, not fully comprehending what was happening. The police officers continued to shout at him till he complied. Afterwards, this man said, "They lectured us energetically till they ran out of words and let us go. They even let us finish with the shoot," he said. Or take the gentleman for whom I took this fairly unappetizing photograph. I guess it depends on if any of you have missed lunch today or are observing Ramadan and did not eat lunch. I apologize for this photograph on so many levels. Now a successful business owner, years ago he and a friend tried to terrorize a buddy and a pizza delivery guy with a fake gun. When police caught up with them, he said, "My baby white face, Letterman jacket, and compliant response to the police de-escalated the situation quickly. At a certain point, I could tell one cop was almost laughing at the comical scene. Now, if we had been two African-American teens, we would have been at least booked, probably jailed, and maybe even shot. Instead, we got back in the car and drove home." "I grew up in a very affluent town," he said. "It was the kind of place where it was easy not to have contact with police. The few interactions I had were very respectful and innocuous. A tap on the shoulder, a suggestion to go home." Not everyone is afforded that same presumption of innocence. For some, in particular, Black men and youth in America, their mere existence is seen as already criminal. This isn't just about those who have lost their lives, right? Consider, too, those who were followed and accused, arrested and abused, chewed up and spat out as if they weren't somebody's son, daughter, sister, brother, mentor, leader, believer, somebody. And while you're thinking about the stories of the people who got away with it, consider the lives, the narratives of the people serving time right now, many for engaging in same or similar offenses. There are, after all, millions to choose from. Take note of the wasted potential. We need to invest rather than incarcerate. Our criminal justice system is teeming with scholars and students, artists, counselors, caretakers, change makers, game changers, community leaders. If the criminal justice system were designed by people who, it's the wrong slide. I hope that, I will tell you what I hope comes out of all of this. I hope that you see a bit of yourself in the We Are All Criminals photos or in these stories. I hope that in that reflection you take note of the context that you allow yourself. So I was young, I was drunk, I was in a bad relationship. I gave it back anyway. No one got hurt. It wasn't my idea. Whatever that context is, recognize that it may exist for someone who is caught as well. Now, that may not be an excuse, but it is an opportunity to recognize a common humanity. I hope that some recognize the privilege you've experienced and appreciate that not everyone has benefited from that same privilege in life. I hope that you reflect upon how very patently different your own life could be had you been burdened by a record. And again, there's a theme here. Consider the foreclosed futures of all of those who have been caught. Finally, I hope that this project inspires you to take action. And this is the slide that I was reading from before. So, you know what, it's so important, I will read it again. If the criminal justice system was designed by people who believe they might one day be involved, or I would add those who have been involved, we would then have justice. So I ask you, what's your story? What would your chalkboard say? What would life be like for you if a Google search found not your LinkedIn profile or your carefully curated Instagram or Facebook page, but instead your mugshot, your criminal record? What would life be like for you if you always had to check yes? A criminology professor in Georgia, her name's Denise Woodall, has been asking students about how people in prison or those with criminal records should be treated. So for example, how many meals a day should people in prison receive, 2 or 3? Should they be allowed to study behind bars, to work after release, to live near you? After recording these answers, Professor Woodall asked students to recall their own criminal histories, acts that went uncaught, and consider what life would be like had they been prosecuted, punished, and labeled a criminal. Then she circles back and asks those first questions once more. Professor Woodall tells me, for example, that more than 50% of the time, students who first said that people in prison should receive only 2 meals a day changed their responses to 3 after realizing that they themselves could be the ones denied dinner for the next 8 years. What would that class's initial response have been if there were more students who had been arrested in the room, more students who had gone through the system? We Are All Criminals seeks to close that empathy and that opportunity chasm. This is a call for reason, for equity and mercy, and acknowledged ownership in the problem as well as the solution, so that soon, when Anthony, the gentleman that I told you about way back when we started this call, when Anthony opens a sheet of paper, a page that's used to define his character, he finds not thief, but father, caregiver, nurse, speaker of 6 languages, survivor of genocide, volunteer coach, and avid reader, a man not defined by his worst moment, but by his true worth, with the luxury to forget and the opportunity to be forgiven. A man not tethered to his past, but wholly able to live in the present and to dream of a future. And what a beautiful vision that is for everyone. Thank you.
Emily, thank you so much. I invite everyone who has comments or questions to add them to the chat. And while people are doing that, I wanted to ask you one of my own. I know that you have done a lot of presentations on college campuses. You've done it here at the University of Minnesota, certainly more than once. and the sort of display that goes along with the website has been up at the University of Utah to our whole entire incoming freshman class before. And I'm wondering in particular what the reaction has been of students on college campuses when you've done these presentations, and anything that sort of strikes you about how this message is reaching the population of students that we're all educating.
That's a great question, Grit. In fact, I wish that you would have told me you were going to ask this because I
told you I was going to come up with something.
I have a slide that I could have shared with you, but I suppose that the dear listeners will have to go online to find that particular participant. But I'll share with you an example of a story that I use on college campuses to help students work through this issue that we are all criminals, because certainly not all students and not all people that I first talk to are amenable to this to the statement that we've all violated the law, right? So it's a photograph of a woman under a bridge holding an umbrella in front of her face so it obscures her identity. And I tell students that this woman is in her early 20s, that she recently graduated from college, and that she didn't come to me with a particular story or offense in mind, but rather, quite beautifully, with a curiosity, with an openness, with a humility. She said, look, I recently graduated from college. I'm sure I've done something, but I really can't remember what it was. Maybe you can help me. What do you think I've done? And so then I turn that question back to the students and say, what do you think she's done? Now, obviously, I'm asking them from their own personal experience, what do you think is likely that this woman has gotten away with? What are some common activities on college campuses, right? And it's amazing. They usually, I believe that this woman ended up admitting to about 15 offenses, and the students can usually guess all 15 within a minute. Because this activity is so common. Everything from underage drinking to false identification, right? She used her sister's ID to buy the booze. She said that maybe it didn't count because after all they were related, and so we had to talk about how that does in fact count as an offense. Public intoxication, public urination, public indecency, theft, which is incredibly common, of course. She said that she would leave campus parties, and on her way back to the dorm, she and her friends would stop by a campus pizza by the steak place, and there was this setup where the first person would take your order. There were 3 people up front. The first person would take your order. The second person would take your money, and the third person would give you your slice. She said that they would just skip the second person. So they would give their order, they would take their slice, but they wouldn't give their money. She said, technically it's not stealing since it was my pizza. So we have a long talk about technicalities, but those things help the students start to consider that the activities that were just a crazy Friday night or something that they laugh about with friends over cereal the next morning is something that, if they weren't in this campus bubble, something that could have drastically rerouted their life's course. And so in the same way that I try to find stories that will trigger memories in different audiences, I think that's the one that has been the most effective on college campuses. And students have been, by and large, very excited about this. I think that when we consider that the students that are, by and large, in undergrads right now, so
18, 19, 20-year-olds, that all they've ever known is mass incarceration. This isn't a new phenomenon to them. This is the United States. This is who we are. This is what we do. And I think that they see that this isn't working. This is a failed experiment, and they want to know what they can do to begin to, dismantle this destructive system that we've created. And so, yeah, the students by and large have been very excited about the project.
I have another question through the chat from Christie, which is something that we talked about as we were preparing for this presentation. So Christie says, you address the Common App's criminal background questions and the inherent potential negative impacts based on past behaviors and convictions. In cases of recent campus code conduct violations ranging from vandalism to drug alcohol violations to violent offenses, so that could vary campus by campus, but they're generally, they have a lot of similarities. What are your thoughts on institutions sharing that information with other campuses where the student may but may not pose a future risk on other campuses? So if there are parameters, for example, on how long that information may be shared with other institutions, do you believe that that practice is problematic, assuming that there would be those parameters in place? Because there are increasing public pressures, accountabilities, and legislation demanding this type of notification practice. And that's something you and I talked about, that people, both admissions and registrars, have increasing pressure to really ensure safety on campus. So how do you address that with the type of topics that you're talking about?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Christy, for that question. And I will say that when Ingrid and I talked about this beforehand, I did make clear to her, and I hope that I've been clear to you, that I am by no means an expert in admissions policies. What I can tell you is that it's important to strike a balance. It's always important to strike a balance, both with admissions and with sharing. And I think that if you follow some basic guidelines and of course work within your own structure to create guidelines, then with some very basic principles in mind, that you can create a system that hopefully works. So for example, if we were to look at not the practice of sharing information, but how a college accesses criminal history, right? The idea of asking the criminal history question on either the college or the common application or in some other admissions form. There are some schools across the United States that are doing some very interesting and innovative work to try to mitigate the harm that those questions have on applicants with criminal records. So, for example, at NYU, I believe that their current solution is a bifurcated admissions process where the first round of evaluations takes place without the knowledge of whether the applicant has checked that criminal history box. But before an offer is extended, there is a second review of the application, specifically where one looks at the criminal history question. And there is a specially trained team of reviewers that evaluate that criminal history. I would imagine that one would look at brain development and juvenile acts and mistakes, evidence of rehabilitation, but also race bias and the realities of living in an over-policed space, both in the neighborhood and the school, and so on, when assessing that record. And doing this all with an understanding that people, especially youth, can change, and that education can help open doors and minds and worlds. And I think that what is key to a lot of that is that the people who are reviewing the information are trained. They know what they're looking at. I think it was ACRO's former ED, Mike Riley, if that name sounds right. He said something along the lines of, as an admissions director, he didn't believe that he possessed the expertise to evaluate who a real threat was and who was just a teen caught up in an unfair system, a teen that might be in the best position to benefit from a college application. And so I think that if, and I now realize as I'm saying that this doesn't answer poor Christie's question, which is basically how
does the school that has generated that record, how did they begin to share it, but rather how does the school in question, the one that wants to evaluate that information, how and when and why and where should they be able to access that. So I guess, Christie, what I would say is that I would be very cautious in sharing that information and in understanding how it can be misused to lock students out of countless opportunities in life. But that's not to say that there should be a complete shutdown on information. At no point am I suggesting that all criminal records, for example, should be abolished, right? That we should have absolutely no record of what one has done and been convicted of. I think that when used wisely, when used cautiously, and when handled with expertise, one can engage with information contained in a criminal record in a way that can both honor the opportunities that applicant may have, but also protect the campus and the area where that student may be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of what you're saying is, I think what Christie's getting at is you share the information, and what someone does with that information, you sort of started out by saying when you get the information, having certain systems and processes in place that strike that balance is important. But the other part of Christie's question was, I mean, sometimes you don't get to choose, right, what the other institution does, so that balance needs to be on both sides. I'm going to switch over to one final question, Emily, that just came in from Aaron, which is what types of trainings would you suggest for admission staff that do review the conviction reports, or what kind of resources should they reach out to? That's a great question.
That is a really great question, and I realize now that our clock is ticking down, but I did have several other things that I wanted to say about engaging with criminal records. I think what I can do is send to you, Ingrid and perhaps Cass, information on...
So wait, Emily, we can go over a little bit if Aaron wants to wait around too for the answer, just so you know.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
It won't just click out.
For the extension. Yeah. Okay. So circling back, because I think this is important in understanding how to engage with a criminal record. You know, if your institution can ban the box, of course, in many situations, I think that is preferable. What that means is just taking that initial question, criminal history question, off the application. But what a lot of schools are doing, like I said, NYU is one. There are a few others as well. The University of Minnesota has an interesting solution to their current query. At least take it off the initial application. And then when you do ask that question, you know, have you ever been convicted or adjudicated delinquent of an offense, narrowly tailor that question. Look only at convictions, for example, so not adjudications if one was underage, or not just arrests or charges. Look only at felonies, the serious offenses, and not the misdemeanors or petty misdemeanors. Consider recent offenses rather than casting a net that reaches back for several years. You know, in some states there's no floor on how young or how old a child must be before they can be charged with a criminal offense. You know, there are children as young as 6 who have been charged with assault crimes, right? So consider what that means when you ask for a criminal history that could reach back a decade or more for just a child. Think about what it is that you want this criminal history to be used for. What is your concern? Is it housing? Then limit your question to those who are applying for on-campus housing and not for everyone. Don't use blanket denials. Don't say that anybody with a criminal history or anybody with a particular criminal history, regardless of recency or relevance or severity, is going to be locked out. So again, circling back, narrowly tailor that question.
And then
Emily,
provide the opportunity.
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Okay, provide the opportunity to demonstrate growth, rehabilitation, mitigating circumstances. If you're going to make an assessment based upon the information that's in front of you, make sure that you've got all the information. Engage with the person whose record you're assessing, whose character you're assessing. Have experts, the next one down, have experts in the room reviewing that information. For example, with juvenile histories, you can have stays of adjudication or deferred adjudications that speak volumes to someone who has practiced in juvenile law, someone who has been in the courtroom. We understand that the world of criminal and juvenile justice exists in gray. There really isn't black and white. But on that criminal record, things only appear in the binary, right? It's either guilty or not guilty. Either you're a criminal or you're not. Either you're good or you're bad. And really, that's just not how the system works, and it's not how life works. And so if you have experts in the room who can, who can engage with that information in an intelligent way, I think that's absolutely key. Provide a clear and accessible path for appeal so that people have the opportunity to respond if they have been denied the opportunity to obtain an education in your institution. And then continue to evaluate and assess and grow. And this kind of circles back to what I was trying to rather inarticulately say to Christie, is that this is a process, that it has to be something that you continually work with as other institutions change, as laws change, as the landscape of our juvenile and criminal justice system continues to shift, hopefully for the better, for the more humane. These are questions that you can continue to change to. So be adaptive. And then keep in mind that the students who are already enrolled, those who are on the campuses, like the ones that Christie was talking about, they may need legal help. So they may need assistance with expungements, so removing that criminal history from one's record, or they may need help with an appeal if they're denied the opportunity to engage in an internship because of their criminal history. Invest in the students that are on your campus, understanding that their prefrontal cortexes are not yet fully developed, and chances are they're going to be violating the law. That doesn't mean that they should be locked out of opportunities for the rest of their life. It just means that consequences
Emily,
should be.
Yep. Sorry, I want to interrupt you and kind of just circle back, because I think you've spoken to Aaron's question generally, which is like part of it is the process, right? Part of it is how people are coming in. And then you talked about the process after, the review happens, if there's an appeals process, and you talked about having experts in the room. And I wonder if one of the things Aaron's getting to is sometimes part of your process, oftentimes part of your process cannot include anyone other than you and maybe your colleague in a registrar's or admissions office, depending like how things are, maybe someone from a college, depending on how your process is. So you might have people who are simply the people you have that are part of that process. So if you cannot introduce people that have that kind of expertise into the process and you yourself need to develop it, are there venues for people to kind of get that sort of exposure of the things to look for, how to interpret things, assuming that you have a process that either is narrowly tailored or you don't? How can people sort of educate themselves on how to read those records?
Sure, and unfortunately there isn't just one resource across the board that everyone can use, because criminal history reporting varies so wildly jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But what I would recommend, if you cannot, widen your table to include people who have expertise in the issues. And I guess I don't know who NYU has at their decision-making table, if they have with them child psychologists or people who have worked, lawyers who have worked in criminal and juvenile law. But if you don't have the ability to extend the invite
to join the team 2 people with that particular background, then I would say look for in your area trainings on reading criminal background reports. You'll find these with private data miners who will often give free or low-cost trainings on how to read or interpret the information that they cull together. You'll also find with public defenders' offices or those working in second chance or criminal justice reform may also offer these trainings. And then I would say if you don't see the trainings that exist, then reach out to the organizations that either provide opportunities for second chances for people or to, say, a public defender office and ask them if there is any kind of resource that would be relevant to your jurisdiction, presuming that the majority of the applications that you would be getting in are from your jurisdiction. If they're not, then the more national private data miners may be able to provide information that is a bit more broad. So, for example, like LexisNexis or other, I think ESI is another one, if I recall, employer screening information, I think. There are other data miners that may be able to provide that training for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that addresses Erin's question, and those are some really good resources. And certainly, I would invite anyone on the call. I know that we're going over time, but if we have other folks on the call that have either questions or things that are really specific that you want to follow up on, you can certainly contact me. Cass, I'm assuming my information is on the ACRO website or somewhere. I can even throw it in the chat here. If that's the right thing to do. You can certainly contact me and I can follow up with you or get information from Emily and we can answer questions as well. And I'm not seeing additional questions come through. Like I said, we have gone over time. I really want to thank everyone for coming. And I wanted to just kind of leave too with a parting thought, which is that Emily talked about one of the things that I've taken away from my relationship with this project, even as someone who has been affected by incarceration, is I remember it feeling so hard, so difficult. It must be so difficult to end up in prison or end up in jail, to end up with a criminal record. And it has only been through time, even though I have some personal experience with it, that I've realized that perception of remoteness of this is because of my own privilege, and that the faces of the people who have the luxury to forget are faces like me. I am the one in 111 white women. And so that really, even when you are affected, I think part of the takeaway too is that you get a second chance. And I don't have a criminal record myself, but it has felt like that, and it doesn't precede me in conversations with people. So I hope that that's something that participants in this webinar and others take away, is that feeling of sort of remoteness of the likelihood of this happening. There are people for whom this is a very likely thing that will happen to them because of many things that are stacked against them. And I hope that awareness has helped you just have a perspective that you can take back to your work, and that this has been a unique experience for you amongst maybe other webinars that you will do through ACRO.